Hello everyone, my name's Joy. Welcome to this session, and I've just realized I've got to say got it before I can even begin to talk as well. So we've entitled this session Pushing Back on the Pushback, and we'll tell you a little bit about what the session's about in a moment. If you're here, and you're very welcome to be here, you've either been part of the Equality Republic movement, or you've been someone who's been interested in our work. So you're very welcome. As I said to you, I'm part of an organisation called brap. We're an equalities and human rights charity. And really what we're trying to do in essence is to disrupt, I think, the ways that we've usually approached issues of equality and human rights, so that we can begin to get the change that we say that we all long to see. And that's a kind of difficult entanglement for us, because I think many of us are very wedded to the idea of doing something to deliver equality. We really want to have greater equity in our society, but we're less thoughtful as to how we achieve it. And I think that's partly what we're trying to do when
you're on mute.
You're
John.
on mute.
Have you just noticed that I'm on mute? Have I
No,
been on mute? Have I been on mute all the time? And I've just been saying some really fantastic things, and it wouldn't put it past them, you know, my colleagues, to let me be on mute all the time. So sorry if you missed any of that, and thanks for letting me know. So let me tell you a little bit about Equality Republic. So as I said to you, we're really interested in brap, in disrupting the status quo, not for disrupting its sake, but because we really want to try to bring around the change that we say that we want to deliver in our society. And what we wanted to do, by way of supporting others to do this too, is to begin a movement called the Equality Republic. And the Equality Republic started last year. It's really taken off, and it's really a spiritual movement, a movement of people who are very interested in not being satisfied with the status quo, and working on themselves and their practice to be more than just equality practitioners or leaders that comply, but more people, to be more aspirational about what we actually want to do in the name of equality. And the idea of creating a republic is we wanted to create a different space, a different land, if you like, a virtual land where equality has a chance to flourish and to be what it says on the tin. So that's the idea of the movement. And it's not our movement, as in brap's movement, it belongs to everybody. And if people are interested in doing things that really want to forward equality practice, wants to shake things up a bit, want to do things that things are really going to help to bring about some of this change, then please get in touch, because we've had lots of offshoots of people doing things which have been great. So people have taken up the mantle and done things in their own right. So the last thing I want to do before I will hand over to Diane and Lashni, my colleagues, is to talk a little bit about the calendar events. So we have a number of things coming up. So the event that you're here to talk about is Pushing Back on the Pushback. I suppose we have, over the last year and a half, been the busiest I think we've ever been. We've been absolutely demented. And Lashni and Diane will talk about their lack of sanity and how challenging the last year and a half have been, particularly in relation to anti-racist work. And the idea of this event is to explore with you, and it is a participative event. So we want to explore with you our experiences of working on anti-racism, but also our experiences of pushback, and how we address that, and invite you to think also about how you address pushback in your work. And for those of you that don't understand what I mean by that, I mean that thing where people say, we want to work on X, Y, and Z, and then make it absolutely impossible for you to do it. So that's really what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. on the 4th of November, we've managed to secure, that sounds like we've put her in prison really, but we've managed to secure Julie Diamond, who has written this fantastic book on power. And she has, she's somebody that we've been working with a lot because she has a tool which helps leaders to actually understand the difference between the intent and impact of their power. And it's a really very cute session, and I would advise people, if they have time, to come along to that, because sometimes, well, really at the heart of what we're trying to do is to disrupt power. No easier and simplistic way to put it. So it'd be really helpful session for lots of people. On the 11th of November, we've got another OD consultant from the States, Heather, now Severin, say her name the American way.
The French way, you mean?
The French way, sorry.
Heather Bertou, yeah.
Heather Bertou. I love the way Severin says it, because I say it the American way, which is doesn't sound as nice. But she's going to be talking about some research she's done, which is it's really insightful actually, because it begins to offer us some insight into why some of our good intentions don't actually land well. And she's done a lot of research on charitable sector organizations that do a lot of work around social justice, and the fact that there's often a distinction between what the organization wants to do in the world, the good it wants to do in the world, and its ability to deliver that good. And she talks a little bit about her research, which makes that distinction clearer. Also really very good session. And then finally, a proper final session for this year. Now we're keeping your November evenings very occupied, actually. I'm just noticing that is we've got a session called The Painted Ceiling. And in this session, we're really looking at the arts and how the arts funds and what it funds, and the way, I suppose, the way that the arts has responded to anti-racism, and maybe not responded in the way that we possibly would think it should have. So it's a little bit about accountability and how we get some true accountability for the things that culturally nourish us. So that's kind of me doing the advert. I'm now going to get off and leave the session to Diane and Lashley to run. Diane and Lashley are core parts of our facilitation team, really talented facilitators, but I suppose above all, I would say their commitment to brap and to this agenda, it just knows no bounds. And the work that we've been doing together over the last period of time has been endless, but it's been deep and it's been meaningful. So one of the things that I would like to applaud Diane and Lashley for is not only their ability to keep doing this work, but to refresh and to renew themselves and to be really thinking, how can we make this more meaningful in terms of our delivery? So we're not just churning it out, but so that we can really make an impact on how this work lands with others. So I'm going to hand over to them now. It's going to be a participative session. I hope you're going to enjoy it. And thank you for listening. And I hope to see you at other things that we're going to be doing over the next period of time.
Thanks, Joy. Good afternoon, everyone. I was almost going to say good evening, but that would have made me feel really tired. So, so good afternoon. What we want to start with, I think Lashley's going to share the screen. Is that okay? Okay, I'm trying to make sure I can see everyone. Okay, so as Joy said, we've been kind of, I suppose, very activated in this space in terms of talking about and helping people think about anti-racism. And I have to confess that actually, I think I probably first started talking about anti-racism in education back when those people who are old enough might remember Elia. You know, they talked about anti-racism a lot, so it's not a new thing. But in terms of our approach, there's some things that we, I suppose, our definition, if you like, and our way of thinking about it, there's some things that we take as given. And I'm saying this knowing that quite often, I'm sure people in here are going to say, yeah, I know that. But quite often when we meet people, they'll go, oh, I've never heard that before. That's really surprised me. So I hear that it's new for people. So for us, race is absolutely a social construct. That isn't in dispute. We often are quite clear about not taking a load of time in engaging with why it might not be. We don't do that. We're also understanding and recognizing that we're talking about power, and Joy just said that a minute ago. We're talking about power, we're talking about dominance, and we're talking about oppression. And they're the key things to thinking about anti-racism and the idea of how do we tackle those. We also are very clear that we're talking about a system that's in place. So absolutely there's stuff around the individual, what individual behaviors and actions might be, but system is really important. There's a systemic thing going on and we need to be very clear about that. We are deconstructing whiteness because it's a system and it's central to doing anything that we could possibly call anti-racism. We've got to understand that and how it plays out. We are unapologetic of it, I suppose, saying that racism is pervasive. And often people say to us, once they see, it's kind of like, oh, they are seeing. You'll see lots of definitions that talk about anti-racism. It is an active position. It isn't, we've been saying this thing that it's not, it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's about things that happen rather than the opposite. There is definitely intersectionality and we are not ignoring that in any way. And actually quite often, if we really understand anti-racism, it helps us think about intersectionality as well and what the impact then of if we were anti-racist could be. We absolutely acknowledge we're still learning. We're on a journey with this with people. And so therefore we are not doing these sessions saying, oh, I've got the answer up my sleeve and here it is. It's a lifelong journey and it's lifelong work, which you might want to switch off now and go. But the fact is that that's what it is. In terms of our work then, we facilitate learning and conversation. So we're not doing training. And the facilitation bit is more and more about getting people into that deeper conversation. We recognize that we're taking people from the comfortable to getting uncomfortable. And uncomfortable is where the stretch happens and where the learning happens. So it's quite also a holistic endeavor. So we know that your body, your feelings, everything is involved. Our whole histories are involved in thinking about this work. We're absolutely evidence-based in our approach as well, but we're not like slaves to the data, but we are evidence-based. And we also think this has to be experiential and we're emergent in thinking about the practice. So we're not knocking out lived experience, and people's stories are really important, but they're part of a suite of things. And in the last, 2 years, we have worked with something like 150 organizations. And also, when we've counted it up, around 10,000 people talking about anti-racism. So that's a sweep of people who are wanting to do something on this agenda and thinking, actually, you could only join if you think something can happen that's different. So that's good. I'm going to hand over to Lakshmi for the next 2 bits.
Hi, afternoon, everyone. So as well as thinking about, we kind of wanted to frame our approach to anti-racism, the kind of work that we're doing. We've also been thinking critically always about our impact with the people that we work with, so participants of sessions that we might run. And this is just a bit of a flavour, really, a bit of a reflection on what we think our impact has been. So the evaluation processes that we're taking part in are telling us that people are learning. So there is something shifting. Some of that's to do with deeper reflection on the self. As we recognised earlier, or what Diane said was that when we're working on anti-racism, we're working not only on the system but on the individual. There's an interrelated quality in that. So some of the evaluation we're having is saying that people are recognising that they're doing deeper reflection on themselves and trying to, comprehend where they sit in this agenda, how they play into or push back on anti-racism, which we understand is kind of key to the work, really, to understand yourself in that. We also know that people are saying they're doing deep dives into changing their world perspectives, and I feel like I've been using the word discombobulated a lot recently. So people are feeling a bit kind of unstable, unbalanced by this shifting gaze. We often talk about looking through an anti-racist lens, and that being somewhat new to people. So looking at the world through this new lens has been somewhat of a kind of foundational piece of work, but also one that can leave people feeling a little unbalanced, in a good way, I'd say, because it's one of those paradigm shift moments where you need to be able to see the world differently to be able to critically do something different. And there's a better comprehension of systemic impact, and that's really important to us. So over the history of working on racism and anti-racism, there's often been this idea that actually individual acts are the things that are problematic, and there's been a reluctance or a difficulty in seeing what is systemic. And some of the evaluation feedback we're getting on the type of work that we're doing is telling us that people are starting to comprehend that there is systemic impact with racism, and so there has to be systemic work to be anti-racist. So deeper and more confident conversations have been important, and we tend to do that and have noticed that people have found it really helpful through modelling holding difficult and challenging conversations. So we're always relating back to this idea that anti-racism is not just a cognitive work. You can't kind of learn all the terms, read all the books, and then feel like you're being a really good anti-racist. There's something about what it is you're doing, the way you're behaving, how articulate you can be, how confident and competent you can feel, and we're modelling holding those conversations as often as possible inside of the sessions that we run. And then that people recognise that this is collective work. So when we're talking about it being systemic, it also means that it needs many hands to do the work, and so people are recognising you can't just can't stride out in this on your own and hope for the best. There needs to be a collective work in it all. So all of that, our approach to anti-racism, the work that we're undertaking, the impact that we're noticing with the people that we work with, has also made us really think about our experience of pushback. And Joy kind of headed you up on what that is, so this idea that people are saying, yes, we want to be in the space, and no, thank you, we don't want to do any of the things you're asking us to do, and the fact that that comes up in many, many different ways. So just a flavour really of some of the ways we notice it in a place or a space with people is that people find it difficult to talk about race, which sounds like a really odd thing to say when we're talking about anti-racism, but surprisingly, really delving into a deep conversation on race can feel difficult for people, and it can be one of the first hang-ups they get to. So that's been our experience, that it can be quite difficult to talk about race. And as facilitators in this space, we meet a lot of challenge. So people tell us that they want to be in the space, they show motivation to be in the space, but they can be quite challenging once they get to that space, and that can look a number of ways, and it can land in quite a personal way. So when you're facilitating in this space, what you might notice is that it doesn't feel like you're having a debate. It can sometimes feel like someone's poked you directly in your chest, and that's sometimes because that is what they're doing. So there's a number of challenges that come up that aren't just about holding professional space, but that it can land very personally with you when it happens. And when those types of things happen, it does take race off the table. So when we enter into what's happening, the relationship dynamics between facilitator and participants, when people are finding it difficult to communicate, it can sometimes move race off the table completely, and we're in a completely different space. There's something about kind of holding it in that space. it's always possible, Diana and I were talking about this earlier, it's always possible that there'll be a disruption in the space, because we're disrupting people's beliefs, people's values, people's idea about how the world works. And then Diane said, actually, maybe it's that we always expect it as well. And actually we do. So it's something, when we're thinking about working in anti-racism sessions, we're already plotting what might come up that's going to throw race off the table. It's really helpful for us to do that. And what can be really debilitating for people in that space, or what can create a strong pushback, is the sense that we're questioning your belief system, the way you grew up, the values you hold in your family, societal values you may have brought into. I mean, this is kind of high energy stuff, isn't it? People have a response to that, and we notice that as pushback in the space when we're working. So it can be really highly emotional. You may be working in professional spaces. The hope is that everyone's holding, you know, same as we do. I'm sure you always create ground rules at the beginning. There's this idea of how you're going to treat each other in space, and then as emotions come into play, it all kind of falls off the table. And it's really no different. In fact, I'd say it's probably amplified when you're working on anti-racism. So what we notice is this is an emotional place. Anti-racism, like I said, is not just a cognitive work. People's feelings are in it, their belief systems, the way they grew up, the way they see their parents, their partners, you know, all sorts of things are at play. And that's emotional stuff. And that emotion certainly erupts into the space in a way that can feel like pushback. It also means that it can disrupt communication. So if you think about the types of things that happen when you feel agitated, upset, it can disrupt your logical thinking, your ability to articulate. Communication can get really complicated or long. So we sometimes say to people, simplify what it is you want to say, because we disappear into kind of really abstract conceptual terms and nobody really knows where we've gone. So we're talking all the time and modeling with people how to kind of have conversations that are very real and open and help people connect in communication. But that disruption certainly can be a type of pushback. So sometimes what we notice, is a little flag for me, is when people start getting really cerebral, when people start quoting at me from research papers and start telling me about concepts of history and law, I think something's happening here that's stopping you from engaging in anti-racism in the way that I'm hoping you're going to. That's certainly a part of pushback. And that power is at play. So in any space we're in, it's not neutral. So everyone comes in with their own types of power, multiple types of power. And certainly one of the things that we notice is people utilize that power sometimes to really good effect in sessions around anti-racism, to take race off the table. So as it gets uncomfortable, we kind of put on all our different power hats and we'll use them effectively to shift the space and stop conversation. It's something that happens quite a lot.
So the nearest tube station.
And we can have there can be a racialized component to this. So we work at brap in, sometimes we're working with other Black facilitators, sometimes we're working with white facilitators. And what we've recognized is some of the pushback is dependent on who is facilitating. So you may find that pushback looks or feels different to a white facilitator than it does to a Black facilitator. It may be completely different if there are 2 Black facilitators or 2 white facilitators in the room. So there's some nuance in that. There's a racialized component to how that pushback will land. And then finally, there's this thing about the good and bad binary. So you may have heard of that term. Robin DiAngelo talks about it a lot in terms of race. But some of the pushback is that people sense that we're saying that they're bad people. By talking about race at all, we must be, you know, trying to deconstruct the very person that they are. And that can be really problematic when you're trying to keep people open to new ways of looking at things. It's a real way of pushing back. And sometimes what that means is people kind of feel defensive. They respond by thinking, well, actually, I'm a good person. And if there's a binary, that means that that facilitator must be the bad person. And then you'll get some of that pushback as well. So there's a lot at play in terms of the relationship dynamics. And I see that some people have been nodding, which makes me think, all right, we're saying some things that you have also experienced or been in a space with. And we wanted to give you an opportunity to have a bit of a conversation about that as well. So this is the audience participation bit. What we're going to ask you to do is move into smaller rooms. We've got those set up for you. And just for a few minutes, is it 10 minutes, Diane, we've got for this?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so for 10 minutes, we're going to ask you in those small groups of 3 or 4 to have a discussion about what kind of pushback you experience. Maybe that you find it's very similar to the types that Diane and I have gone through with you. There may be some other aspects that have occurred to you whilst we've been talking. So have a bit of a conversation about it in your breakout rooms, and then we'll come back into the main plenary and you can feedback some of those themes if you would like to.
So in our group, almost everybody had got something to share about pushback that they'd had. That we had in our group that a lot of us got quite emotional about it was that around allyship, and I was describing, we all had examples of where white people had actually tried to really forward the agenda around race disparity, race inequality, and had actually had some pushback. And that is so daunting. It has major implications of, we will not be able to address the race equality agenda without white people and white allies, in the same way that I always sort of say, women never got the vote in this country alone, despite what the suffragettes did and the sacrifices that they made. We got the vote in this country because men allowed us to have it. And when we're trying to challenge race disparity, Black and minority ethnic people will not be able to do this without white allies. So, and I was in a meeting yesterday where a white colleague who's leading some really important work said she didn't feel she was the right person to move with this agenda because as a white woman, she felt really nervous about it. And I think that's really awful that it's a pushback that people then start internalizing and questioning themselves as actually moving this agenda forward. So we all know that when we're trying to push this agenda as Black and minority ethnic people, it's weathering, but it's going to be weathering for white people as well. And if we're all in this together, we need to kind of push together and get support from each other, because that's the only way it's going to happen.
Thanks, Shanaz.
I was
Go ahead, Deborah.
so I was just sort of sharing in terms of my sort of experiences. Yes, there was white pushback, but there's also Black pushback as well, and that related to positions of power, whether in terms of looking at it from their perspective is that they've been given these sort of positions as to that they're responsible for taking forward the agenda, and they become the sort of gatekeepers. I was speaking to one colleague who was invited, who's an ex-army, and is invited along with some high brass to speak about his experience. He now runs a heritage-based sort of website. And after the meeting, one of the Black race leads approached him and asked him whether he was serving or not. And he says he's no longer serving. And he was reminded that this was a forum for people who are currently serving. And he had to remind the person to sort of say, well, doesn't my experience of having sort of served actually count? And it was almost like that, he felt that he was being welcomed to the meeting by everybody else, but apart from the one person who happened to be sort of Black, who was responsible for the EDI agenda.
Thank you. That sounds quite heavy, actually. Like being taken down and pulling rank as well.
Yeah.
Jamie?
The ones I was really conscious of, first is whataboutery, just a constant, no, but we should be talking about class, we should be talking about gender, we should be talking about anything other than race. And the other one that I know you're very familiar with, Diane, of silence, white silence, which I think comes from a place of many different emotions and thoughts, but the effect is often still really challenging as a facilitator, just wanting to sort of reach out and knock on people's foreheads like, hello, are you there? Is there anything there?
Thank you. Yeah. Vicky?
I think there's certain connection in our group across different sectors. So we had charities, we had NHS, we had football, and about kind of it's sort of lip service to priority. So yeah, this is a priority, but actually we haven't got the resource, and it's very difficult to balance doing this with doing all the other things we have to do, and having kind of conversations about it without doing the hard graft, without doing the 9 yards of you actually looking into your own organizations and getting stuff sorted. And it was just it really kind of resonated across different sectors for us that was a pushback.
Anyone else want to feedback anything they haven't heard from their groups?
I think if I might share a thought, in my group there was an interesting conversation, which when you kind of stood back from it, you realize that there's the individual pushback and then there's the system pushback, and it's about trying to understand where does the individual sit in relation to the system. Is the system the individual, or is the system dictating to the individual? And so it becomes quite a complicated thing, A, to understand, and then B, to know where to push, because you could go into the filing cupboard and find policies that say we are good at equal opportunities and we provide all of this stuff. But then in practice, when you see it being put in place, what you see is a massive pushback from the system, and those policies in the cupboard gather dust.
Thank you. I'm tempted to call you Mr. Music because that's what's on your account. I don't know your name. Can you use Mr. Music for now? Vicky, you put your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, just one other thing I remember that we talked about was the kind of anti-wokery pushback, which is in my world is kind of quite political. There's quite, from the political sphere, but also on social media. There's a lot of it on social media. And Jamie, if you don't mind me sharing this, Jamie said he was harking back to the good old days when it was political correctness gone mad. And we were saying how much better it was then, and how we wished we could have political correctness gone mad rather than anti-wokery, because it's just so insidious and ugly.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking that a couple of things that you that got mentioned from Shana's all the way through, kind of right back to anti-wokery, is something to do with being cancelled. That kind of cancel culture. If you get it wrong once, that's it, you're done, no space for you again, which is sort of threading through some of the things that you're talking about, actually. This idea that you're putting yourself out there, and some of the pushback might be, if you get it wrong, you've got to go. Should we share up our next slide, Diane?
Yeah, good. Let's make sure I haven't missed anyone want to say anything. Yeah, go ahead. What we're going to show you now is we thought about how this almost behaves like a bit of an economic system. And we're all really versed in economics now. In terms of, we get diminishing returns in relation to this work, depending on the organizations, who it is you're working with, etc. So we've got this kind of arrow that's going down, and it's like, that's a diminishing piece. So if you're thinking about the top bit then, well, in an organization, in doing this work around anti-racism, people become alert to racism. That's what we get in the sessions. People say, oh, actually, there's things I didn't know, and I'm really, I want to know more. And I'm finding that, I'm taking these glasses off and seeing some other things. And they try to then seek to do something about it, whatever that something might be. One of the challenges is then it gets hard. And once you start to see things are going to land and disrupt, or that it means disruption and change, one of the things we have to think about is what that means for us, but some of the things you just said about how you are noticing that lands with other people. So in a way, what I wrote down when the first person talked about being a white person doing this is that you're a traitor. And, you know, all these mates you had are suddenly silent when you walk down the corridor or whatever, or get on screen because we're not in corridors anymore. But, you know, you're feeling that palpable experience of being treated differently. So it gets hard. You're put in a space that there's lots of ways in which it's made difficult. Maybe information isn't shared with you. You know, you're not in the spaces where you get to speak to people, or people say they're going to do things and actually nothing happens and you are left waiting. Then it looks like you haven't done what you're supposed to do. You know, all that kind of stuff. And it's uncomfortable and we experience discomfort, and this is kind of impacting on the ability to do anything, and sometimes the desire or willingness to do anything, or even to see what the things are that you might do because of that feeling of discomfort. And what then continues to happen is we start to kind of abandon some of the ambitions. Maybe we pare them down. You know, so the very kind of maybe transformative stuff you wanted to become a bit performance, you know, a little bit like, in terms of impact. And you pick something that's far easier, something that's shiny, nice, and people like, often something that's already been done as well. And the result is that we're not addressing the causes and the experiences that people are telling us about. And the consequence for saying of this model around diminishing return is that in terms of the learned behavior, when we can't address things and it's uncomfortable and we can't solve it, that's learned behavior that makes us get into this cycle. We're diverted very easily onto this. But there's another consequence, and I'm often talking to people in organizations about this. It's not just what you do, it's what you're seen to be doing, but it's also what we have led people to believe we are committed to doing. The result is that people of color lose faith that things will change, the cycle continues, and that we mean to do anything. And then it's really interesting then that what we get with this anti-racism work is then organizations are saying, but we're trying to get people on board and they won't come, and they haven't actually accepted the last how many times. The pushback meant that people stepped up and believed something and nothing happened, and the expectation that you keep doing that is unreasonable, and that there's not a recognition what it costs you to do that as well. So I hope that kind of resonates with people and your particular experience of how this works or doesn't work. Does that make sense? Okay. We want to move on to the next one. I don't want to do like slide and slides. I'm trying to make sure if anyone wants to say anything that you can speak. I'm pretty sure that we have organizations that are absolutely breathe a sigh of relief when they see this diminishing returns happening. Yeah, you're back on the thing.
Okay, so it sounds like it was a helpful model actually for
people
to look at, making sense.
I think I saw Jagwant. I think Jagwant was speaking, but it was maybe on mute.
I was, but you can finish and I'll come in later.
Julian, I think you came off mute as well.
Yeah, Jagwant, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking in terms of when we saw things happening, as just mentioned, that things have happened before. And one of the sayings that we used to have is the old definition of madness. If you keep on doing what you've done before, you're always going to get what you've always got. Yeah. Which then obviously poses a question, okay, what do you do about it? Yeah, if you know what the sort of playbook is and you get to sort of realize what the playbook is, how do you go about circumventing it? And I suppose it's easy for us who are no longer working in organizations to say this, is the notion of accountability. Yeah, because if pledges are being made and that performatism is going out, how do you call out that performatism in a sort of constructive way and hold people to account. And it's easier that to be done outside of organizations than inside of organizations. And you'll also find that there are some people, well, it's definitely the case in the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s, where people started working in organizations, they used to work in communities, and they used to have to straddle the community side and the organization side in terms of trying to move progress.
Yeah, it's really it's interesting, isn't it? Because I also think that one of the things that happens around that model is that it's quite nuanced, the way those things happen. So, you know, I was thinking about abandoning ambitions, retreating to something easier. That doesn't always look the same every time it happens. You know, people get really good actually at being quite sophisticated in moving things around, and it's not until you're 3 weeks after the event that you think, actually, hold on, I think we've just changed the agenda. I think actually you just took it off the table, but it can take us some time to get to that. And I think that thing you're saying, Jaguant, about you know, it repeats and repeats and people get used to it, and also we kind of start to accept it as part of the culture of the space. You know, so we'll start to accept, actually, this is a place where people come up with ideas, and then we notice that it won't quite work, go back to the drawing board. And sometimes that's framed as something quite positive about the place. You know, so we'll sometimes think, actually, this is a really great place. We're so thoughtful, reflective, really careful before we do things. And there's some tension in that, isn't there, around actually what is it serving to kind of slow down? What is it serving to critique, reflect? Is it really taking us where we want it to, or actually is it a bit of a subversion of what it is we're trying to get to?
Julia?
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much, and thanks, Jaguant. I think what do I want to say? There's something, I found that slide really helpful, and Jaguant, your input as well. And I think, sort of speaking from my experience as a white facilitator in anti-racist space, and some of the naivety that I've seen in myself and sometimes other white people of, I think you kind of expect pushback, but you also expect support. And in particular, you expect support from people of colour inside the organisation. And so if it's the employee resource group, or if it's the, you know, someone in the group who is a BME individual and they're pushing back, I can be a bit surprised by that. And I think it's this point about, yeah, just not necessarily understanding the legacy that's going on there, how difficult it is to put your hope all over again, and then to keep having that hope dashed. So actually then people withdraw, they become cynical, they actually become as possibly as kind of invested in the status quo because it's too difficult. Hope is the most painful thing in a way. So that's, yeah, I'm starting to gabble now, but I think there's something that I notice in myself and other white people. We can often be kind of naively and overly surprised if it's non-white people who are making the pushback.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, actually, because the assumption of, I suppose, I can't think of another word besides allyship, and I don't mean that entirely. When potentially you've not shown up on this agenda before. So that potentially is the other issue. And I was thinking, if my daughter's listening, she'd also say, your 2 steps of doing something is going to get you a lot further than her 10 steps. Yeah, so there's also that, like, the whole tension of fighting on for some turf. And yeah, that can be pushback too.
The other thing that is related to what Julian was saying is that not just that it might be bred from a place of worry, you know, being well experienced and not being hopeful because you expect people to let you down, but also because people may genuinely have just bought into the system the way it is. And it can, my experience, you know, of working with white facilitators is that can be alarming, you know. So I think I got really well set on anti-racism, I think I know how this works, and then someone who has lived experience of the negative impacts of racism is telling me I'm getting it wrong, and how that can be quite a dissuading factor. And we often say you really have to find your equilibrium in this work, because there'll be many different people and places and systems that will try and kind of disrupt you from what it is you're doing. That doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes. You know, I'd say the probability is 100% you're going to make some mistakes. But that also you may hear some very persuasive arguments for why you may be wrong, and they may come from unlikely places. But that's where you kind of have to be really, you have to have a good foundational understanding, comprehension of what it is you're trying to do. And sometimes you're going to have to stride out into that space, hoping that you're doing the right thing. So there's a bit of risk in that as well. Is there anyone else that wanted to add anything before anything you're thinking about in terms of that model, or anything that really resonated with you? I know people have been adding in the chat that the things they're hearing from other participants are helpful.
I was thinking what you were just saying then, actually, about risk, and risk, I suppose, there can be pushback in all kinds of ways. I hope what I'm saying makes sense. So there might be a reluctance personally to take certain risks because of the pushback that might get you with people that you have to go on and continue working with. Or there might be an organisational risk aversion. So the organisation, for example, might say that they want specific actions on equality, but then not be prepared to tolerate the discomfort or what might come out of that. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, we want change, but not like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or we said we wanted change, but we don't know why you're trying to make change. We just wanted to say it.
We want it to be nice change, not uncomfortable change. Yeah.
Everyone's favourite kind of change, the one that's really easy. I feel like you're sort of taking us, the way the conversation's moving is taking us into our next slide that we wanted to show you, that will frame some of the things that you've been talking about already. Is that where you were thinking to go, Diane? Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, that's the right thing.
Okay. So I'm going to share up a slide with you on a typology of pushback. So we're thinking about, how do you notice this at an individual level? How might you notice it as an organizational level? How might you notice this at a societal level? And we've got a number of things, and some of them you've already spoken to, so you're recognizing. I think it's really interesting actually to think, someone mentioned earlier that you were in breakout rooms with people from many different sectors. You know, you landed in a room, all sorts of sectors, and you're noticing the same patterns. So this idea about pushback, this isn't something we've pulled out of the air. We know that this is happening in a patterned way, and that pattern really disrupts us from the anti-racist journey that we're hoping to take, or hoping organizations or society are going to move toward. So the types of things you might notice, on an individual level, you may notice that people will settle, compromise. So you know where you're heading, and then I sometimes say this is like the current under the water. So you think you're heading in a really particular direction toward the shoreline, and then you suddenly notice you've been deviated to a completely different island because the current underneath you has just kind of swept you along. You didn't notice till you got there. So that settling, compromising can do a bit of that. On a really individual and in an emotional place, people feel fearful. There's fear of getting it wrong. There's fear of what happens if things change. There can be fear about what you might lose in doing this. So that all types of fear, and we know that fear takes people to different places. So for some people, fear takes them to a place of needing to fight their way to safety. Other people become very silent. Other people need to get away. So that, there's all sorts of things that happen when we become fearful. On a very human level, our bodies respond to that, and our brains do as well. People get quite shocked. Oh, sorry, Dan, you can say something.
I've got a lot of echo, sorry. I'm just going to say something about fear also, and that is that sometimes people know they've been one of the ones. They know they've done stuff. They know that they have been derelict, that they've been overtly discriminatory. So there's that also. It's not just a worry, I might be wrong. It's a worry, now you're going to know I was wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really helpful framing. Thank you. Yeah, the fear that people are going to know now, or they're going to start talking to me about the things I've always done. Yeah, absolutely. There's also shock. So people can just kind of feel like, I can't believe this is happening, not here, not with us, not in the things that we do, not in me. And that shock can take them to that kind of frozen place, or needing to get away, wanting to fight, defend themselves. And similar things can happen with anger. And anger shows itself in a number of ways. I know someone mentioned silence earlier. That can be very present with anger, as can many other things I'm sure you have experienced. As people find that their views, their beliefs, their systems are being questioned, it can take them to an extremely emotional place. And there's risk. So we've talked about that a little bit before this, but there's risk in doing this work, and people are aware of that. So a little bit like Diane was saying around fear, you might find out what I've done. There's also risk that you may have to give up some of the privilege and advantage you got gifted. I've started thinking about, I attended an event by Resmaa Menakem where he talks about advantage rather than privilege, and I think it's a really helpful framing for privilege, skin color privilege, because privilege just sits with you. Advantage you use, advantage gifts you something that's usable. And part of the risk in doing this work is that you have to start giving up that advantage, leveling that playing field, and that can feel a really difficult thing. So I know we have worked in sessions before where we've talked to people about, are you ready for that advantage not to be available for your children? Are you ready for that advantage not to be available for your friends, for your family? Because that's what we're talking about if we're going to enter into this work of equity. There's emotional labor in the work, and that people can find that very difficult. It can take them to a place where they can feel very tapped out, or that it's too emotional. They expected it to be a cognitive process, a learning process, and suddenly their emotions are all bound up in the work and it can be too much. And you can experience that as a pushback. What comes up very frequently around race is not feeling like you know enough around language or terminology, and we'd really dissuade people from getting overly hooked on language and terminology, because it's a shifting landscape. It's fluid, it changes, it will continue to change. So this idea that you could know enough to then enter into a meaningful dialogue is a pushback, because you can enter into the dialogue in many ways, and you can make mistakes and kind of come out the other side. So there's something about it being a way of taking race off the table rather than delving further into what can feel like unknown ground. Naivety, I think, came up. So my goodness, are you sure? But it's so lovely here. I'm so lovely. The people I work with are so lovely. So there can be this kind of childlike, I think Diane sometimes describes it as a childlikeness when we're talking about race. And I would really challenge that anyone has got to this day and age and not know that racism is active and not know how it plays out. Sometimes what has happened is we haven't given it our critical attention, and that's where the naivety comes from, rather than a not knowing. And then what aboutness has already been covered very well by you as you were thinking about pushback. Diane, were you going to do organisation, or was that me?
Can people hear me? Because I'm getting feedback, but I don't know. Hopefully it clears. Okay. So in terms of organizational pushback, the idea that we just need to get more data, more numbers, more stories, more. And there's lots of organizations that are, data rich and intelligence poor. So it doesn't matter how much of this stuff you get, it doesn't seem to shift people, but we keep at it for years and years before anything actually happens. So that's one of the challenges, if you like. And we've often talked about hierarchy of oppression, that we actually have this pyramid, and some things we feel are more important than others, and we want to push the ones we perhaps aren't connected to us or we don't care about off the table. So, and race is one of those that is very much subject to that. We also think, actually, we need to set up some groups and get the people affected talking to each other about something about the effects. And then we need to put some special programs on so that we can very often locating the problem with those individuals rather than it being a system issue. So, but if we set up that, and you know, in some organizations, it can take a couple of years to get one group together to do something. So, you know, we've really gone on a go slow. So that's another action. The need to constantly consult and outsource this. We are all people who potentially are the people who are asked to perhaps come in and do things, but quite often we have to be quite discerning to notice what it is we're being called in to do. And sometimes it's stuff that's already known, and it's about slowing down a process or putting it kind of in a drawer somewhere to gather dust. Then we also have people who go, we need to do it tomorrow, you run with us and let's get on with it. And, you know, and actually that also is a form of, yeah, we should have done it yesterday. That's a form of pushback too, because it stops us from really thinking very carefully about what it is that we would need to be doing. And I guess sometimes it means we do anything rather than something. And they're kind of quite different things. Deprioritizing as well. There's other things that are more important. You know, I spoke with somewhere a couple of days ago that talked about, you know, we've been too busy to attend to anti-racism. You know, we've had too many things to do, and you kind of think, oh, so that's business that's someplace else, and the real work is not about this. So we often hear about resources. There's not enough money. We haven't got the right people. There's not this. We've got to put all these, like, we've got to play the chess first, get the pieces in place before stuff can happen. And that's often a go slow and pushback. We all know bureaucracy. It's a very good friend of ours. But also that it can be a monster in terms of pushback. And the same thing around risk. What does it mean for us to do this? Are people going to know? You know, we've seen, I've been quite interested in, I think it's the National Trust at the moment, that they've so far stayed on a journey when everything around them is saying, get back in the mansion, you know. And it said that, yeah, something, it's quite, it would be really easy to just go, okay. And there's a massive risk to that. You know, lots of organizations are, we're not going to give you any more money now, we're not going to do this, etc. So those are big issues, and absolutely you can back off when that happens as well. Do you want the last one?
Yeah, you might notice that you're seeing some similar things across the those three areas, and that's because we notice that they do show up in those different areas. Might show up differently, might be kind of a different presentation, but we're looking at some of the same stuff. So when we look at a societal level, there's fear about change, that feeds something that's later in that list, which is preservation. You know, we like things the way they are, it works. Why would we change it? Is there a need? There's been some quite interesting pushback that we've been watching around decolonizing curriculums. You know, how do we do that? But what about Ari? But also, what about you know, what about the way we do exams then? Well, what about how the teachers are going to do it then? And actually, I think it's really interesting to think about how quickly we will shift society if there is a need to preserve life. So around COVID, we made some rapid changes in society, unheard of changes in our lifetimes, made it with extreme speed and taking some risks because it was necessary to preserve life. So it's interesting to think that actually something that we know kills people, knows life limiting, is not treated with that same urgency in societies. There's kind of a fear of what happens if you change things. There's a question, some of the pushback can be a question about legitimacy. Are you sure this is happening? Is it happening everywhere? Do we need to attend to it everywhere? I live somewhere where this isn't an issue. So it's a way of kind of pushing back on what is a systemic issue that is prevalent all over the place. And even present in your specific area doesn't mean it's it should be less of priority in that place. There's the myth of meritocracy. So surely we've built a society that means everyone can make it. We've seen people make it. We've seen particular people make it through, which means anyone can make it through. And actually what we're talking about is systemic inequality and systemic inequity of opportunity. And that's really what we're working, rather than this kind of societal belief that we can all kind of make it. And we get sold that in a number of ways, don't we? So media sells that to us all the time, this idea that anyone can make it if you give it a good try. It can be minimized. So the issue of race and people being racialized can be minimized out in the world around us. And we sometimes see what we've playfully called the steel bands and samosas, so celebration of diversity, because diversity should mean inclusion, and what we're saying is they are not the same thing. So you may have a very diverse place, but it does not necessarily mean it's an inclusive space. So that celebration, that enjoyment of different cultures feels like it's the work, and we would say there's a much deeper work than celebrating of difference or celebrating of diversity. What aboutness came up before, it's come up again, because it comes up all the time, and there's no surprise, I'm sure, for you that if you look through the paper on any given day, you'll find a whataboutness in there about race. Preservation we already talked about, and in society we often do this thing where we'll say, oh well, it's something that happens to an individual. A person did something to another person, it was racist, it was dealt with by our very fair system, and now it's gone. And actually a reluctance, so part of the pushback is a reluctance to look at it as a systemic issue. And we've seen that in all sorts of ways recently, through very formal channels, saying that there is no systemic issue at play, which really brings into question the legitimacy of talking about race at all. So some quite strong, pervasive, insidious pushback that takes race off the table. Does that all make sense? Is there stuff there that you're noticing that kind of resonates with what you know?
Have we missed anything?
Yeah, that too.
I guess something that's sort of striking me is that, particularly with the organisational stuff, a lot of those things seem to have, in my mind, kind of a common link in terms of depersonalising this, and people not just taking personal responsibility and looking inwards and just, making something a project, or, looking at data and evidence and intellectualising it, as opposed to treating this as a very sort of personal human issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kat. It happens a lot in systems, doesn't it? And we often in the work that we're doing, we're saying to people, the system doesn't exist without you in it. So there is no system without the people. But I think you're absolutely right. There's a kind of way of stepping back from it by saying there is a system out there and then there's me over here, which kind of creates this idea that you're neutral, that you're outside, that you could be objective. And actually really part of the work is placing yourself inside and really recognizing I play a part here somewhere. There's the opportunity for me to surface what that is and then do some things differently. Anything else come up for anyone? Just want to give you a minute because there's a lot of stuff on the slide. Lisa, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. It was really interesting. I'm similar reflection, I think, to Kat about how recognisable the organisational stuff is. I mean, I think I recognise it across all, but particularly the organisational, and just actually a sense of some of those things I absolutely can see it now because of where I'm at in my journey. But really recognising that so many of those things feel, for most people, are going to feel like really sensible things, that the pushback isn't as, I guess it's what's making me recognise that some of the pushback we're going to face isn't going to feel like pushback in a traditional sense. So it's just switched a big light on in my head about particularly the fight around things like risk, around resources, because I think those are going to be legitimate things that crop up in organizations as to why we don't do things. So like it. Thank you. That it was just a resonating hugely point.
Just looking at the time, Diane? Do we
Yeah,
want
let's move on so
Yeah.
that we don't keep people longer than 5. So we have this other, we thought about what are the strategies and what can we do as much as you can do about pushback. And maybe, I suppose one of the things we're saying here is about being alert to what might happen. Every time I say that word alert now, it bothers me. But so the idea of building, building relationships with organizations that we plan to work with the individuals. So we kind of almost can head some of this off at the pass, so we know that it's going to be happening. Yeah, that we know that it's going to come up. And so the better our relationships, the more likely we are to be able to manage some of this. And that's very much linked to being clear about what and how we're contracting, so that you don't get caught up in that busy work of here's the data, here's the stuff, before we can actually get on with anything. I mean, quite often we'll say to people, you know, the idea of needing stories, etc., not because we're discounting stories, but quite often the organization has them. Yeah, so the another sweep to get another lot isn't really shifting anything in terms of understanding and doing stuff around anti-racism. Roles and responsibilities, what are our expectations? Who is going to be doing what? What are we expecting in terms of the organizations and people that we work with? Then understanding and distinguishing between anti-racist work and other types of equality work. And that very much goes with, you know, the bit on the slide where we said the steel bands and samosas. Are people celebrating? Are they doing something that's transactional, performance? Or is this in the intention here to be transformative, to really shift something? And quite often, if there isn't a clear understanding what we mean by anti-racism and the stuff around action and power and all those things, then quite often it's not doing what people think they're doing. And we need to be clear about that for ourselves. So it's very much linked to what's the foundational knowledge that you need then about this particular space that you're in, what is possible here, etc. We talk about slowing down as well. What we found in the last 18 months is that a lot of organizations have been shown up by, you know, their figures have come out, or they've been called out on social media, or all of those things. And they want to rush to something to make it look different tomorrow. And sometimes one of the ways of then dealing with this is to let's slow down and let's see what it is that we really need to do. And so that we can almost action planning, if you like, in a way that means that we are also ready for these barriers and these things that come up. We talk a lot with organizations about the emotional labor and planning in the support for themselves and for the individuals that's doing the work, because we know people's friends suddenly turn, you know, the very people they thought would help them, that they could go chat to, that, you know, there's sometimes people top out as well. So your friend that you could talk to, I don't know, about examples, and you could share these horrible stories, love them. But actually there's a place where that's voyeurism, and they don't mean to do anything beyond the stories. And when you start to come with something else about what we might do, then the experience of how people are treated then, and the response to the kinds of things they say, mean that actually we say to people, be prepared for what this is going to feel like for you, and feel like for some of the people in the organization on the receiving end, where you've got all that fear and all that. Well, what are we doing this for? And finally, sometimes we have to walk away. Sometimes we have to say that this is not, we don't do work this way. This is, we're not going into this relationship with you, if you like. This isn't the type of relationship we want, whatever it might be. But actually, sometimes pushback is saying, I don't want to. And sometimes taking control is saying, actually, we're not going to engage in this process with you, because it ends up being like this bit of a dance where actually quite often you're not going anywhere in that. And I'm sure there are going to be others there. So in our last 7 minutes or so, what are your thoughts? Where are you? Observations, questions for each other?
Sorry, can I come in? It's Hamid Khan here.
Yes, go ahead, Hamid.
Yeah, hi. It's been really interesting. I think, first of all, I was really pleased to see a title that was really kind of eye-catching and wanted to draw you in, pushing back on the pushback. And I think very much so in the past, we've been pushed back many times, but we never pushed back because we just kind of put our heads down and kind of pretended that it's not happened, or we don't acknowledge it, or we just kind of feel oppressed by it. But I think this kind of notion about pushing back on the pushback is quite empowering in itself, and it's quite an assertive approach. And it's really good that we talk about strategies on how we kind of take some stance on inequalities and racism and kind of deal with creating a fairer society, or becoming strong advocates for kind of reducing or eliminating racism wherever possible. So what I would like to say in terms of what can we do collectively going forward from here, maybe even if it's, even we call it pushing back on the pushback forum or something, where we can support each other, where we can come to and say, this is how I've been feeling the pushback, and what could I have done different to push back to ensure that, because sometimes I think I become vocal not because for myself, but more like if somebody's done this to me and I'm feeling this bad, this could be avoided for somebody else if I could change the mindset of this person. And sometimes that's the key driver for me. It's quite draining, it's quite tiring, but it keeps me going. I'd just like to hear what others' views are in terms of how we can support each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamid. I think your question really is of the other participants, almost around how are you building a community that kind of supports some of the difficult work that you're doing. I don't know if some people might have some ideas about how they're doing that, or how they've found that journey, finding kindred spirits in the work.
So Hamid, I mean, I can share that, yeah, it can be quite isolating, it can be very weathering, it can be quite frustrating, and it does take its toll. So I think, you know, I think you've really got to, it sounds like that's what you're doing, just get the right support, you know, even it's kind of sort of sharing experiences and sounding off with other people about scenarios, and this is how I dealt with it, what did you think, you know, just getting that support just to revitalize your energy around this is quite key. So I just kind of do it instinctively. You know, if I'm faced with particular problems or issues, I just generally have a network of people that I can call upon, you know, whether that's a couple of people or individually, I might just give somebody a ring.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, interestingly, I think what Hamid has also done is kind of surfaced a different type of pushback that comes through when we're doing this work, which is you can feel a bit gaslit. So you feel like you're raising something that you've taken the risk, you've been courageous, you've stepped into the space, and you might get met by a wall of, no way, we don't see that here, we don't really know what you're talking about. And actually building that community can be really helpful of other practitioners who are saying, no, we're meeting the same types of pushback, we're recognizing these are patterns that are at play, and then thinking about that collectively. I mean, you've done that a bit today, you've surfaced that in a variety of sectors you're hitting the same pushback, hearing the same things in different spaces. Kat, you've got your hand up.
Hi, yeah, I just agree that it's been helpful. We found to kind of try and build relationships internally in our own organisation, and to build a mini collective, but to try and work across the whole team. Still really, really, really difficult. But yeah, I don't think I'd be here today if we weren't doing that. But actually for sanity saving, joining a wider collective like this, to like take stock and hear about what everyone else is doing is like, okay, right. Like, yeah, still doing this.
Okay. Sheena, you put your hand up too.
Yes, so thank you. It's been a really, really useful and insightful session. And just one of the things that I can perhaps share from my experience is that I think sometimes the pushing back almost has to be doing nothing for a little while. I suppose it's your version of walking away, and then sometimes waiting for the risk of inaction to happen, and then accepting that that gives you another opportunity for engagement. And I appreciate that there are pros and cons in that approach, because it can seem as if you're leaving an urgent problem. But sometimes if the people who need to listen won't listen, you're almost better waiting until something happens that they'll listen to somebody else and will then perhaps come back to you and engage with you about how to move things forward.
I suppose it does mean that walking away isn't doing nothing. It is a signal, yeah, and a very powerful one as well. Yeah.
Yes, I think perhaps yes, it's kind of being persistent, but behind the scenes, maybe, yeah.
Okay, I see we're coming very close to I hope people have been able to capture things that are in the chat actually. There's something about, you are a community of anti-racist practitioners potentially. Is there something that can happen in relation to that? And the idea of not acting on your own, kind of that relationship building, but both within and outside of organizations, I think is really important. I had this image when someone spoke a minute ago about we almost feel like we're aliens coming into a setting where you're kind of going, I mean you no harm, I mean you no harm. and that's like a really peculiar position to be put in. So it's just something that popped into my head. But yeah, this is part of the work, is these kinds of conversations that we have with each other, and that we believe something different can happen. So we're at 5 o'clock.
We are. I'm just going to share up as our final slide, just to remind you of the other events that are coming up in case you'd like to. Oh, there's some quotes there. There we go.
Those quotes are also in. I think you've just had the 2 documents, and they're in there too. Yeah.
So there's the calendar of events coming up for November. That's just the November ones. So do keep an eye out for other events. I mean, that we recognize some of your faces, which means that you're kind of feeling connected with us and you're feeling connected with each other. So there's, certainly opportunity to keep building on those connections. And thank you so much for being with us on a bit of a rainy afternoon, and yeah, and being so participatory. That's really helpful for us as facilitators. We're very glad that you found it useful. So the feedback we're getting in the chat looks like you're finding it helpful. So we're pleased to hear that.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yeah,
and have a good evening.